Joachim mentioned my review of climate change policy for the Australian Prime Minister and state ministers, state premiers in Australia. That was the result of 18 months rather deep immersion with a very strong team of Australian researchers, and my first deep immersion in the climate change issue. I've been bumping into the issue for some time, including at IFPRI, maybe especially at IFPRI, where earlier work a few years ago was helpful in bringing attention to the vulnerability of many developing countries to unmitigated climate change. And after that, drawing attention to some of the risks to poverty, to welfare in developing countries, of distortions arising out of poor climate change policy, as Joachim mentioned. Agriculture is an important dimension of climate change policy. It's important because agriculture is hugely affected by climate change. And also because agriculture, forestry, land use are important sources of emissions. For the world as a whole, something like a third of total emissions at the moment. They happen to be the third of emissions that's probably cheapest and easiest to change, or at least some of those are, especially related to deforestation and better use of soils and better management of vegetation. And some of these easier and lower cost sources of mitigation, especially in developing countries, could be done relatively early. And so the ambitions that we can have for rapid reduction in global emissions will depend very much on including agriculture and forestry in a global regime. And being able to do things quickly and early is going to matter a lot because we're too late. The concentrations of emissions in the atmosphere have been growing very quickly, especially over the last decade, as the other side of the coin to the wonderful process of accelerated economic growth in the large developing countries, first of all China, but also India, Indonesia, other developing countries. The early 21st century has been a time of exceptional growth through the big developing countries and through much of the developing world. Our mind has gone off that for the moment, distracted by the global financial crisis, but my assessment is that when the financial crisis is all over, we will see slower growth, a pretty bumpy road for the countries that were at the heart of the financial problems, the United States and a number of countries in Europe, but we're going to see a quick return to very strong growth in the major developing countries. And that's a good thing, a wonderful thing. But the other side of the coin is that we'll return to rapid growth in emissions unless we've put in place effective mitigation regimes which break the nexus between economic activity and levels of emissions. This is a problem, climate change mitigation, that's not going to be solved in one or even a few countries, even the very big ones. 80 or 90% of the growth in emissions that I expected when I prepared the report between now and 2030 will be growth of emissions in developing countries. Because of the developments of the financial crisis and the bumpy road for the United States and major countries of Europe, we're going to be talking about more than that, an even higher proportion of the growth of emissions being in developing countries, unless we've put in place comprehensive mitigation regimes. A lot of the discussion of climate change, including in this town at the moment, has an air of unreality about it. It goes on as if we've got plenty of time. Well, we might have had plenty of time at the time of the Rio conference in the early 90s, time to experiment and to play with politics, but we've run out of that time. At 450 parts per million concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, there are substantial risks, and we're pretty well there now. And even with the global financial crisis, the rate of emissions now is still increasing those concentrations. And there's a lot of momentum in the system. The emissions that are already in the air will be affecting climate over the next couple of decades, even if there's strong mitigation now. We don't have time. To get an effective policy response, it has to be one that deals with emissions in developing countries as well as developed countries. And this is another area where there's an air of unreality about the discussion. It is unfortunate. It's unfair that developing countries need to think about this issue at such an early stage of their development, but the sad fact is that there's not going to be a solution to the global problem without the substantial developing countries being part of a global regime at an early stage. To get their participation, it needs to be a fair regime, one that recognises the differential importance of growth and growth in emissions in lower income countries. And that was the basis that I set out rather elaborately in the report to define as a basis for a possible global agreement. I ended up coming to the view that to be seen as being fair, to have a chance of getting developing countries in, that we're going to have to converge towards equal per capita entitlements for emission at some time in the future. Obviously, there has to be time for adjustment. Within a contraction and convergent framework that gave us a chance of stabilising emissions at 450 parts per million late in the 21st century, that would require Australia to reduce total emissions from 1990 or 2000 levels, that happens not to be much difference, by 25% by 2020 and something like 90% by 2050. And the United States and Canada, we're the three big per capita emitters of the world, and also the countries with strong population growth. The United States and Canada would need to be looking at similar sorts of ratios. The Australian government has now, after a bit of wobbling, accepted my recommendations on that, and accepted recommendations that even if there's no international agreement, we should be reducing emissions by 5% by 2020, but 25% in the context of a global agreement. But we need to be quite explicit about the principles of allocating a global budget for emissions, I think, or we're not going to get a global regime that adds up to a solution. It's going to need to be a global regime that deals comprehensively with emissions, that accounts for emissions from agriculture and forestry. Mostly these are excluded. They're only included at the margins in the Kyoto arrangements. There's a big research agenda that needs to be worked through before we can be confident of including these issues confidently in a global regime, but we've got to get on with that because we've got much better chances of achieving ambitious outcomes if you do have comprehensive inclusion of agriculture, forestry and land use. All developing countries accepting targets, or all substantial developing countries accepting targets, runs against the grain of current discussions, but it need not be inimical to development if these are fair targets, and hence my search for formulae that would pass that test of fairness. Once you've got all countries having targets, you've got a potential for trade in permits, in entitlements, between countries that do better than their target and those that don't do as well. And this can be the source of a huge incentive for developing countries with opportunities for low-cost reductions in emissions, especially from forestry to participate fully in Australia's two closest neighbours, with which we've got very close relations, Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. These are big issues. The Indonesian government, and Indonesia is in absolute terms the third largest emitter in the world after China and the United States, so it's no small part of the story. In Indonesia, ministers are quite clear that it's only in the context of being able to provide incentives down through the economy, including to rural communities, by being able to sell excess permits into an international market, that they're going to be able to manage the politics of mitigation. The Papua New Guinea government has indicated that it thinks it could reduce emissions by half by 2020 and become a zero net emissions economy by 2050 if it had these incentives in place. And my assessment is that that's quite a reasonable, quite a realistic objective. But you've got to have the systems in place, the opportunities for trade in permits and the comprehensive coverage, including agricultural, forestry, or that won't happen. We're also going to need this comprehensive system and trade in permits, similar pricing of emissions at the margin in all countries, or we're going to get big trade distortions. We're headed towards the biggest corruption of the global trading system that we have at present if every country goes its own way in giving out free permits or otherwise protecting trade-exposed industries. We're headed for a train wreck in that area. We can remove that through all countries having a cap and trade in permits. It happens that if we do get towards such a regime, we'll have removed the rationale for free permits, distorting allocation of permits, and that's going to have very large budgetary benefits for your country, for mine, for other developed countries at a time when dealing with a long-term budget problem is going to be a critical component of restoring some hope and some opportunity of returning to normal sorts of economic growth.